919 FM, your morning of impact. Samm Marshall shares uplifting stories and conversations with people making Johannesburg and the world a better place.
Well, today on the Social Impact Show, we explore one of the most powerful and complex conversations in international law. That's accountability for the crime of apartheid. Now, at the African Commission on Human and People's Rights in Banjul, the Gambia, advocates and legal experts from South Africa, Namibia and Palestine are calling for a stronger global treaty that ensures all apartheid victims are recognized and protected under international law. Joining me now on the line is Professor Lisa Davis, who's the Senior Associate Dean of Clinical Programs and Co-Director of the Human Rights and Gender Justice Clinic at the City of New York School of Law. Professor Davis also serves as a Special Advisor on Gender and Other Discriminatory Crimes to the International Criminal Court, bringing decades of experience in justice and gender-based accountability. Professor Davis, good morning and thanks for joining me.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Okay, so I think, Professor, let's start at the beginning. Let's frame the issue. For our listeners, could you briefly explain what is meant by the crime of apartheid in international law and how is it been historically defined?
Well, the crime of apartheid first appears internationally under the Apartheid Convention of the 1970s. And then we see this crime again in the 1990s when they codified it under the Rome Statute, which governs the International Criminal Court. And that went into effect in 2003. So these are the two international definitions that we have. They're both decades old. The definition in the Rome Statute largely borrows from the definition from the Apartheid Convention. And the problem is that our understanding of race back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, even later, was very much based on outdated ideas that race is biological and based on characteristics at birth. And it's not the same understanding of race that we have today that's reflected under human rights law, which is that race is a social construct.
Thank you so much for that, because are we then arguing that because of the original framing and the change, as you've eloquently illustrated, that what the system meant then in the 70s, 80s, and 90s is very different to it now? So should we then question the original framing now? And if we are questioning that, how does it limit accountability today?
Well, because of this outdated definition that's been cut and pasted through the decades, it's sometimes used as an excuse to exclude victims from the understanding of apartheid. So, for example, Palestinians. We all know what's happening in the Palestine occupied territories has been conditions of apartheid, and that should be held accountable. But it's hard to have that accountability if there's room for a misinterpretation that race is more narrowly defined.
At the African Commission this week, discussions are centering on a new UN treaty on crimes against humanity. What's at stake in how apartheid is defined in that treaty?
Well, the draft treaty is making its way through the UN now. It's going to go into a preparatory committee next spring. So they're looking at the different provisions. And one of the provisions we see in this treaty is a cut and paste of the definition of apartheid from the Rome Statute, which was decades ago. So that would further perpetuate these outdated notions. Now, the difference between the Rome Statute, which governs the International Criminal Court, and the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty is that the Rome Statute has another provision that says that when we're interpreting the Rome Statute, we should look at international human rights law, and we should look at how law has evolved and take a modern approach to understanding the law. That allows us to take a more modern approach to the crime of apartheid for the court. But for the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty, that provision isn't in there, which then leaves the crime of apartheid open to be misinterpreted or misapplied and to exclude victims.
And, Prof, do you think because of that exclusion, that is why those that believe it's not a crime of apartheid, do you believe that that is the basis for their argument?
I do think that this is sometimes used as an excuse. I mean, of course, I think that denying that apartheid acts have happened in places like Palestine is about politics, and it's about not wanting to hold certain perpetrators accountable, for sure. And this conversation, it really matters. I mean, one of the questions I get around the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty is, I mean, is it going to take years for that treaty to go into effect?
For
And there's
sure.
no guarantee that Israel would sign. So how does this affect Palestine or present day, right now, acts of apartheid that might be happening in the world? And the answer is because of reparations. Because reparations is timeless. We can go back in history and identify victims groups and say they deserve reparations. And in Palestine, if we look at a finding of genocide, which is incredibly important, that finding is likely just to go back to October 2023 when this particular war started. But if we want to get decades of victims and decades of Palestinians and thousands more that have been affected by the oppression in those territories, we need to find the crime of apartheid because that's how we would bring them in as victims under reparations.
Yeah, Prof, I think what you're saying is deeply profound. I do find that, and I want to sit a little bit on the fence because I've heard these conversations in different spaces. If we are going to, and as you've said, reparations is timeless, certain groups of organizations or bodies of people will argue that when it comes to reparations, they should be seen to first. And I often then wonder, you're the experts, if that's the case, who is first in line, or am I simplifying it by trying to position one atrocity over the other?
Well, once you recognize a broader group of victims, say, for example, apartheid, that doesn't apply to one conflict first. That applies to all conflicts at the same time. So if you recognize a broader swath of what apartheid looks like, that would apply for Palestinians. And reparations applies equally across the board. I think really the issue with reparations is political will. Will we see reparations for Palestine? Will we see it for other conflicts that are happening in the world, in Sudan, in Ukraine? You know, that's a bigger question about politics and states and where they put their energy and what they prioritize.
I think that's a very important question, and many may argue under the current leadership in America that that might be a ball or a can that'll be kicked further down the line. Talk to me about legal
Well,
language.
first, I couldn't agree with you more about the current leadership in America. And I'm sorry, what was your question?
Yeah, I was saying that under the current leadership, that might be a conversation that will be kicked down the line for another administration to deal with. But talk to me about strengthening legal language, because as you've said, law and the understanding of law has evolved.
Well, that's right. It has evolved, and what we need to do in treaties is we need to reflect that evolving language. Now, we do a pretty good job with that under human rights law, which moves at a much faster pace. But criminal law, especially international criminal law, the wheels of justice turn very slowly, and it takes a long time to produce jurisprudence from international tribunals. So it's a much slower moving pace, and oftentimes the incentive for states is to just cut and paste old language that's outdated because they want to get state consensus to sign treaties or to agree to resolutions. And what this does is it perpetuates old language. For example, we're still using the same language on genocide from the 40s when we know that victims of genocide can go past the four groups that are protected under it. And this is the same thing that's happening with apartheid. So this idea of cutting and pasting a quarter century old language in a definition doesn't help international law. It sets it back. And what we could do to make a change, to bring it into a contemporary understanding of law, is simply change the language from reading as racial groups to reading as based on race. And that's the magic language that would make clear that that racial groups under apartheid is a broader understanding of who those victims are.
And maybe it's a perfect segue to then ask you about the actual conversation that you had at the African Union over the last couple of days. And then also maybe as I ask you that question, to also ask what kind of conversations are you having as a leader with your peers?
Well, these conversations are moving forward within the international community. There are member states that are talking about the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty. I haven't seen or heard any conversations about the specific apartheid provision that's been adopted in there. And we need to have these conversations about changing this language. And that leadership in those conversations, that needs to come from the Africa continent, because that leadership needs to be represented by the experts on this crime. So we need to see South African leadership and Namibian leadership in other states leading on this and leading on this change. Otherwise, the international community just may move forward and keep that outdated definition.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of lessons to your point that you can learn from South Africa. South Africa's own truth and reconciliation process aimed to bring closure. I'm sure many victims will argue, especially black women, that they still remain without justice. What lessons, and you've said that Africa's got to lead this conversation, but what lessons can the world draw from the experience that, especially if it shapes future treaties, from using South Africa as an example?
Well, we've seen South African leadership on the issue of genocide at the International Court of Justice. And that was tremendous in terms of moving the needle and moving the conversation about the atrocity that's happening in the occupied territories. So I think South Africa is well positioned to also lead on this issue. And I think that your point about bringing in more contemplation about apartheid in South Africa, that this process provides for that opportunity. That we know that there's intersectional crimes that happen based on discrimination, whether it's apartheid or persecution or genocide. So, for example, Black South African women and Namibian women who experience apartheid have documented how the experiences that they have been based both on their gender and on their race. And that type of double discrimination also needs to come to light and also needs to be held accountable.
Yeah. Prof, as we wrap up, you mentioned something about political will. And I want to get a sense from you, and maybe it's an Avengers Thanos question, if you could click your fingers. Both in Africa and globally, right? What kind of political will, if you had a magic stick, would we need
to make this change happen?
Yeah.
I think that we have the political will. We just don't have the information. I think states don't know that this is moving forward. But if you look at the amicus briefs that were turned in, the submissions made by states in the International Court of Justice case on genocide, looking at genocide in Israel, there were 25 states who talked about apartheid happening in Palestine. So I think there's momentum and political will to address accountability in Palestine and other places, and to recognize that this definition is outdated. I think most states just don't know that it's outdated, and that this work hasn't become more public knowledge. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to raise awareness so that states know about this and so that they can make interventions with the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty.
And I would argue, Prof, and I'm happy to be rectified by you, but if we don't make justice for apartheid victims a reality, we are already starting to see the effects of generational trauma.
I couldn't agree with you more. Like, part of accountability is not just sending bad guys to jail. It's also about truth and reconciliation. It's about reparations. And it's about letting victims know that what happened to them was wrong. And that it wasn't just a crime of rape or torture or murder or forced displacement, that it was a crime of discrimination, that they were discriminated against, they were persecuted, and that those acts of persecution amount to apartheid or to genocide. And that kind of recognition, I think, is incredibly important, not just for victims to be able to heal and for communities to be able to heal, but also to break the cycles of violence that feed conflict.
Professor Lisa Davis, thank you very much for spending time and talking to us.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. That's Professor Lisa Davis, Senior Associate Dean of Clinical Programs and Co-Director of the Human Rights and Gender Justice Clinic at the School of Law in New York. Professor Davis also serves as a special advisor on gender and other discriminatory crimes to the International Criminal Court, bringing decades of experience in justice and gender-based accountability. And she's talking to us about the African Commission on Human and People's Rights in Banjul. But advocates and legal experts from South Africa, Namibia and Palestine are calling for a stronger global treaty that ensures all apartheid victims are recognized and protected under international law.